The wind swept across the open plains, carrying the scent of dust and rain, whispering through the tall grass like an old ghost that refused to rest. The road stretched endlessly between the red rocks and the dying light, a lonely ribbon of dirt that had seen more sorrow than joy. Along that road walked a young woman, her dress torn at the hem, her face pale beneath the weight of exhaustion. Her hands trembled as she clutched her swollen belly, every step a small victory against the pain rising inside her. She didn't know where she was headed anymore. She only knew she couldn't stop. The sound of thunder rolled far in the distance, a slow, grumbling warning that another storm was coming. She looked up, squinting at the darkening sky, then down again at the trail ahead. Her shoes were worn thin, her feet bleeding from the rough stones. Behind her lay a trail of footprints washed by tears she couldn't afford to shed. Ahead of her lay nothing but the uncertain promise of survival. The towns she had passed through had given her nothing but cold stares and turned backs. No one wanted to take in a woman alone, heavy with child, carrying a story that no one dared to ask about. Her name was quiet on her own lips now, as if saying it out loud might remind her of everything she had lost. Once, she had believed her family would never abandon her. Once, she thought love was enough to keep her safe. But the day they shut the door behind her, their words had cut deeper than the winter wind. They said she had brought shame, that she was better off leaving before the neighbors knew. So she left. With nothing but the clothes on her back and the life growing inside her, she walked into the wide unknown. By nightfall, her strength was fading. The moon climbed over the horizon, pale and distant, casting a faint silver light over the land. Coyotes called in the distance, their cries haunting and lonely, echoing her own despair. She tried to hum a tune, something her mother used to sing when she was small, but her voice broke before the first note could form. She stumbled and caught herself on a fence post that leaned crooked against the road. The baby inside her shifted, a sharp kick reminding her that she wasn't alone, not yet. She whispered softly, her voice raw, telling the child to hold on a little longer. A wagon passed her earlier that morning, its driver pretending not to see her as he flicked the reins and rode on. She had asked for help once or twice along the way, but faces hardened the moment they noticed her condition. Out here, a woman alone with child was a story most folks didn't want to touch. People feared gossip more than they feared God. She tried not to blame them. Maybe they were just trying to survive too. Still, as she walked, a quiet bitterness began to grow inside her, cold and heavy like a stone. When the first pain came, it hit like a wave. She gasped, gripping her stomach, her knees buckling. She sank to the dirt, biting down on her lip to keep from screaming. The wind howled around her, and the sky cracked open with lightning. The world became a blur of pain, thunder, and the beating of her own heart. She crawled toward a cluster of rocks off the road, seeking shelter beneath an overhang where the rain wouldn't reach. The pain returned, sharper, closer, demanding all her strength. She knew the time had come. The hours that followed were a blur of agony and fear. Alone under that storm, she brought her child into the world. The cry of the newborn broke through the rain, thin but fierce, a sound that pierced the silence of the plains. For a long while, she could only hold the baby against her chest, trembling. Whispering words of comfort she barely believed. The wind quieted, and the rain slowed to a whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. She thought of her family then, of the house she once called home. The faces that had turned away when she begged for mercy. Would they ever wonder if she survived? Would they even care to know that their blood now had another heartbeat under the same sky? Her vision blurred, exhaustion sinking deep into her bones. The world faded at the edges. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead. Morning came quietly. The storm gone, leaving the earth damp and shining under the rising sun. The woman stirred weakly, her body trembling from the night's struggle. Her lips were dry, her breath shallow. The child slept in her arms, wrapped in what remained of her shawl. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. She knew she couldn't walk far. She needed help, yet there was no one in sight, no smoke from any chimney, no sound of hooves on the road. Then faintly, she heard something the steady rhythm of a horse's approach. Her heart leaped, torn between hope and fear. She tried to lift her head, her eyes squinting into the sunlight. From beyond the hill came a figure on horseback, moving with quiet grace. As the rider drew closer, she saw that he wasn't like the settlers she'd met before. His skin was bronze from the sun, his long black hair tied back with leather. He wore buckskin and carried a bow slung across his shoulder. An Apache. For a moment, panic seized her. Tales of raids and vengeance had filled every tavern and church sermon. The settlers spoke of Apaches as if they were wild beasts who hunted men for sport. But the man who rode toward her didn't look like the monster from those stories. His eyes were calm, watchful, filled with something she hadn't seen in anyone's gaze for a long time: compassion. He slowed his horse and dismounted, moving carefully, his hands visible, showing he meant no harm. The woman tried to speak, but could barely manage a whisper. He knelt beside her, his expression unreadable as his gaze moved from her face to the baby in her arms. Without a word, he took his water skin and held it to her lips. The first sip burned her dry throat, but it brought her back to life. He then offered her a strip of dried meat, which she couldn't take. Still, his presence alone steadied her. She met his eyes again and saw something unexpected: quiet understanding, as if he knew what it meant to be cast out, to wander the edge of life and death. The baby stirred and began to cry softly. The Apache looked down, then back at the woman, and spoke in broken English. "You alone?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. She nodded weakly, tears forming in her eyes. She wanted to tell him everything. How she had been abandoned. How the world had turned its back on her, but her strength was fading fast. He seemed to understand without needing the words. He looked around, scanning the horizon, then back at her. "You come," he said simply, gesturing toward his horse. She hesitated. The thought of trusting a stranger, one who came from a people her own had feared, made her heart race. But what choice did she have? Her baby's faint cries broke through her doubts. She nodded slowly. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling both mother and child in his arms. She felt the warmth of his chest, the steadiness of his heartbeat. And for the first time in many months, she didn't feel invisible. He placed her gently on the horse, securing the baby against her. As they began to ride toward the mountains, she looked back one last time at the lonely road where her old life had ended. The trail behind her was washed clean by the storm, no sign left of her suffering, no trace of where she'd come from. Ahead, the land rose in layers of red and gold, the promise of something unknown. The wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and smoke. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that it was away from the road that had nearly killed her. A quiet question lingered in her heart. Why would he help her, a stranger, when her own family had turned her away? As the sun climbed higher, her eyes began to close, her body swaying gently with the horse's rhythm. The Apache glanced at her, his expression thoughtful, his hand resting lightly on the reins. Somewhere in his gaze lay a decision yet unspoken, something that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The woman's breath steadied. The baby's soft cries faded into sleep, and the road disappeared behind them into the dust of memory. But the story of how an abandoned woman found a family among strangers had only just begun, and the desert held secrets that neither mercy nor fate could easily forgive. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness as the horse carried her deeper into the wild lands. The sound of hooves on the soft earth mixed with the rhythm of her heartbeat, steady and far away. She could smell pine and smoke, faint but comforting, as if the world itself was beginning to breathe again after the storm. The Apache rode silently beside her, guiding the horse with sure hands. His face was calm, though his eyes moved constantly, scanning the hills and valleys with quiet vigilance. Every now and then, he glanced at her to make sure she was still awake, still holding the child close. By the time the sun dipped low again, painting the horizon in shades of red and gold, the land had changed. The open plains gave way to low hills and sparse forests where the wind whispered through the leaves. A narrow trail wound between the rocks, leading to a small hollow where smoke rose gently from a cluster of shelters made of hides and branches. It was a small Apache camp, tucked safely out of sight from the main road. The man slowed his horse, calling softly to a woman near the fires. Several figures looked up as he approached, their faces cautious. The woman sitting near the fire stood quickly, her eyes widening when she saw the stranger he carried. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the crackle of the flames. The rider dismounted and lifted the mother and child down with care. He spoke to the others in his native tongue, his tone calm but firm. The woman by the fire listened closely, then nodded. Her gaze softened as she looked at the exhausted traveler. She motioned for him to bring her closer to the fire. The Apache woman's hands were gentle as she reached for the child, wrapping it in a soft deer hide. She smiled faintly and said something that sounded like a blessing. The young mother tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The first Apache handed her another cup of water, and she drank slowly. The taste of it, cool and clean, was like life itself. She felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away as night settled over the camp. The firelight flickered across the faces of the people who had gathered. They watched her with curiosity but not hostility. The Apache who had found her sat a short distance away, speaking quietly with an older man whose hair was streaked with gray. Their voices carried softly through the still night. Though she could not understand the words, she sensed that they were discussing her fate. She wondered if they would let her stay, or send her back to the world that had already turned her away. When she woke the next morning, the air smelled of wood smoke and wildflowers. The child lay sleeping beside her, its small hand curled tightly around a fold of the hide. She rose slowly, her body weak, but steadier than before. Outside the shelter, the camp was alive with quiet activity. Men prepared their horses, women tended fires and baskets of corn, and children played near the creek. It was a life unlike anything she had ever known, simple, steady, and free from the harshness of the towns she had wandered through. The Apache who had saved her approached carrying a bowl of stew. He knelt and handed it to her without a word. She nodded, whispering a thank you. He seemed to understand. For a while they sat in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind and the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his English was slow but careful. "You safe now," he said. "Rest, you and child." She looked at him, her heart heavy with questions she didn't know how to ask. Days passed, and she began to regain her strength. The Apache woman, who had first helped her, who she learned was the man's sister, taught her how to grind corn, how to wash in the creek, how to wrap the baby in the soft hides they used instead of cloth. The people spoke little to her, but their silence was not cold. It was a different kind of quiet, one that made room for the presence of others without judgment. Still, she felt like an outsider watching a world that had existed long before her arrival and would continue long after. At night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the camp, the distant hoot of an owl, the crackle of the dying fire, the soft murmur of voices speaking in a language both musical and strong. She often thought of her old life, the white painted house at the edge of town, the smell of bread in the kitchen, her mother's hands busy with sewing. But those memories had turned bitter now. She wondered if her family even knew she had survived that storm. Maybe they had already told the neighbors she was dead, buried her in silence to save themselves from shame. One evening, she saw the Apache man sitting alone near the edge of camp, carving something from a piece of wood. She gathered her courage and went to him, her baby asleep in her arms. "I never thanked you," she said softly. He looked up, his expression calm as always. "You live," he said simply. "That is thanks." She smiled faintly. "You could have left me there." "Why didn't you?" He paused, turning the small carving in his hands, a tiny horse taking shape beneath his knife. "You were lost," he said after a moment. "I was lost once too." His answer lingered in her mind long after she returned to her shelter. She began to see the way his people looked at him with respect, but also with a quiet sadness. There was something about him that set him apart, even among his own. She wondered what it was that had made him say he was lost once, but she didn't ask. Some stories, she knew, had to be earned in time. As the weeks passed, the baby grew stronger. The Apache children would come close to watch him, curious about his pale skin and light hair. The older women whispered among themselves, not in cruelty, but in quiet wonder. as though this child was a sign of something beyond understanding. The man's sister smiled often when she held the baby, saying words the young mother couldn't understand, but felt in her heart were kind. But not everyone was at ease with her presence. One of the elders, a man with deep lines carved into his face, spoke sharply one night near the fire. His voice carried across the camp, and though she didn't understand his words, she knew they were about her. The Apache man who had saved her stood and replied, his tone calm but firm. The tension in the air was heavy, like the moment before thunder. After a few exchanges, the elder turned away, his face set with disapproval. The woman lowered her head, shame burning in her chest. Later that night, she asked softly, "They don't want me here, do they?" The Apache looked at her for a long time before answering. "Some are afraid," he said. "They think your people bring sorrow." She nodded slowly. She could not deny that. The settlers and soldiers had brought war, disease, and broken promises to these lands. Perhaps her presence was just another shadow of that pain. Still, he did not send her away. Each morning, she found new strength in the rhythm of their life. She learned to gather herbs, to carry water from the creek, to move with quiet purpose rather than fear. She began to feel something she hadn't felt in months: belonging. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was real. One night, as the moon rose full and bright, she stepped outside the shelter with her child. The Apache man stood nearby, watching the sky. The light made his face seem carved from the same stone as the cliffs that surrounded them. She came to stand beside him, cradling the baby close. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. "Old life gone," he said finally. "When you lose all, you start again." Like fire after storm, his words stayed with her long after he walked away. She understood now that both of them carried the same emptiness, shaped by loss and rejection. Yet somehow, they had found a strange peace in each other's silence. The world had taken everything from them, but here, among the wind and the stars, something new was taking root. Still, a quiet unease remained. She noticed how the Apache men began riding out farther each day, returning with tense faces. Sometimes, when they spoke in low voices near the fire, she caught words that sounded like warning. One night, she heard the man's sister whisper urgently to him, and though he tried to hide it, his expression turned grave. She didn't know what danger was coming, but she could feel it in the air, the same way she could feel a storm before it broke. When dawn came, the camp was unusually quiet. The Apache man was gone, his horse tracks leading east toward the plains. The woman stood at the edge of camp, her baby resting against her shoulder, staring at the empty horizon. Somewhere out there, the world she had fled from was still turning. Maybe it was finally catching up to her. The child stirred, and she held him closer, whispering softly to calm him. Her heart ached with fear and something she couldn't name. The Apache had given her shelter, kindness, and a place to breathe again. But as the wind rose and the first crows circled overhead, she felt the uneasy truth settled deep within her peace. Out here was only ever borrowed, never owned. And somewhere on that vast, sun-scorched road she had once walked. Destiny was stirring once more. The morning light spread slowly over the camp, washing the land in pale gold. The woman stood at the edge of the clearing, her child pressed close to her chest, watching the horizon, where the Apache man had disappeared. The air felt heavier than usual, filled with a quiet tension that everyone seemed to sense but no one spoke of. The men sharpened their knives and checked their bows, while the women whispered to one another as they worked. Even the children played in silence, their laughter replaced by cautious glances toward the hills. The Apache man had not returned since sunrise. His sister tried to reassure her, saying softly that he was scouting, that he would be back by nightfall. But the woman could hear the worry behind her words. She sat by the fire, rocking the baby slowly, her mind heavy with unease. She remembered how he had looked the night before, calm on the surface, but with something burning behind his eyes, something that told her he knew trouble was near by afternoon. The wind began to rise, carrying with it the dry smell of dust and smoke. From the ridge two riders appeared, their horses moving fast. They were Apache scouts, their faces drawn tight with fear. The camp stirred at once. The older men gathered near the fire, speaking quickly in their own tongue. The woman caught only fragments of their speech, but could read the fear on their faces. The Apache man's sister turned to her and said in halting English, "Soldiers come. From the fort. Many horses." The woman's breath caught. She had seen soldiers before, men in blue coats, guns shining in the sun. They came to the villages and took what they wanted, always claiming it was for peace. She had thought she had left that world behind, but it seemed it had followed her. She held her child tighter as the camp moved into motion. Women gathered supplies, wrapping food and hides, while men prepared to move deeper into the mountains. The Apache man returned just before dusk, his horse lathered with sweat. His face was set and grim. He spoke quickly to the elders, then came to where she sat waiting. "You must come," he said, his voice firm. "They look for you." She stared at him, confused. "Me? Why would they look for me?" His gaze was steady. "They see white woman in Apache camp, they bring trouble. Say we steal you." The truth hit her like a cold wave. If the soldiers found her here, they would not believe she had come willingly. They would see only what they wanted to see: a captured woman, a reason for violence. She rose quickly, gathering what little she had. The Apache man took her hand, leading her toward the horses. Around them, the camp was already breaking apart, the people moving swiftly and silently into the forest. The older women carried the smaller children, while the men kept watch from the ridge. The woman climbed onto the horse, holding her baby close as the Apache man mounted behind her. His arm came around to steady her as the horse began to move through the trees. They rode for hours, the forest closing around them like a living wall. The air grew cooler as they climbed higher into the hills. The woman's body ached, but she said nothing. She could hear the distant echo of thunder, not from the sky, but from the ground. The sound of hooves. Soldiers were close. The Apache man urged his horse faster. By nightfall, they reached a narrow canyon where a small stream ran between high stone walls. Here they stopped. The others had already set up a hidden camp beneath the rocks, their fires small and well concealed. The woman dismounted, her legs trembling. The Apache man spoke with his sister briefly, then came back to her. "We stay here," he said. "Safe for now." She looked at him, her heart heavy. "They won't stop, will they?" He shook his head slowly. "No. Soldiers never stop when they think they are right." As the night deepened, the firelight cast long shadows against the canyon walls. The woman sat beside the Apache man's sister, feeding her child while listening to the faint hum of conversation around them. The men were discussing what to do next. Some wanted to move farther into the mountains, to find a safer place where no white men could follow. Others argued they should send her away, let her find her own people again before more blood was spilled. She felt their glances, though they tried not to meet her eyes. Later, the Apache man came to sit beside her. He seemed tired, his face lined with dust and worry. "They think keeping you is danger," he said quietly, "but I will not send you back. Out there you die." She met his gaze. "If they come, they'll hurt you because of me." He shook his head. "They already hate us. You are not the reason. You are only the excuse." His words carried a weight she couldn't shake. He had seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe in fairness anymore. She wanted to argue, to say that not all people were cruel, but the memory of her own family closing their door in her face silenced her. Maybe he was right. Maybe kindness was only found where you least expected it. Days passed in uneasy waiting. Scouts went out each morning and returned with grim news. The soldiers were camped near the foothills, searching the valleys. Each night the Apache prepared to move again, and each morning they stayed, hoping the danger would pass. The woman began to sense the strain among them. Food grew scarce, temper short. The elder who had opposed her presence from the start spoke more loudly now. Accusing her of bringing death to their door, she tried to help where she could, gathering wood, fetching water, doing small tasks to show her gratitude. Some of the women smiled at her now, seeing the effort she made, but the unease in the camp never truly left. The baby was growing stronger each day, his eyes bright and curious. The Apache children watched him with fascination, laughing softly when he reached for their hands. His presence brought a brief peace to the camp, a reminder of innocence amid fear. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, the Apache man found her sitting by the creek. "Tomorrow, we move again," he said quietly. "Farther north. Hard path, but safer." She nodded, looking down at the child in her lap. "I never meant to bring danger to your people," she whispered. "You brought life," he said. "That is different." She looked up at him, searching his eyes, but before she could speak, a shout rang out from the ridge. Everyone froze. Another shout followed, sharper, urgent. The Apache man leapt to his feet, running toward the sound. The woman clutched her baby, her heart pounding. In moments, the camp was alive with motion men grabbing weapons, women gathering children. She could hear horses in the distance. The unmistakable rhythm of pursuit. The Apache man returned, his face pale beneath the dirt. "Soldiers near," he said quickly. "Too many to fight. We go now." He lifted her onto the horse again, his movements fast and precise. Around them, the camp dissolved into a blur of motion. The people moved like shadows through the canyon, silent but swift. As they rode, the sound of gunfire cracked through the air behind them. The woman turned, her heart racing. Smoke rose against the darkening sky. The Apache man's jaw tightened as he urged the horse onward. "They found us," he said. "We must reach the high pass before they block it." They rode until the stars came out, their path lit only by the faint glow of the moon. The baby cried softly, the sound breaking her heart. She tried to quiet him, whispering words of comfort she barely believed. When they finally stopped, the Apache man slid from his horse, helping her down. His hand lingered for a moment on her arm, steady and warm. "Rest here," he said. "I will see the way ahead." She watched him disappear into the darkness, her chest tight with fear. Around her, the others huddled close, whispering prayers and holding their children. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The sound carried through the night, lonely and low, like a warning. She pulled her shawl tighter, staring at the shadows that moved between the rocks. The night stretched endlessly. The Apache man had not returned, and the wind began to howl through the canyon. The woman closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer. She had already lost one world. She could not bear to lose another. Then faintly, she heard the sound of hooves again closer. This time, she rose, clutching her child, her heart thudding. Figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, but it was too dark to see who they were. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the sound of the baby's soft breath. Somewhere beyond the darkness, fate waited, watching, ready to turn again. The shapes that appeared out of the darkness moved slowly, their outlines blending with the shadowed rocks. The woman held her breath, clutching her baby so tightly that she could feel the tiny heartbeat against her own. Her eyes searched the dim light, praying it was the Apache man returning with news. The others around her crouched low, ready to scatter if danger broke. The tension was a living thing, thick and heavy in the air. Then a familiar voice came from the dark, low but steady. It was him. Relief washed through her, but it was short-lived. His tone carried the weight of something grim. He stepped into the clearing, his face hard, his clothes streaked with dirt. Behind him were two other Apache men, one wounded and leaning heavily on the other. The woman saw the blood on his arm, the deep line of worry on his brow. He crouched beside the fire that barely flickered, speaking quickly to the others in their language. When he turned to her, his voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the truth. "Soldiers close. Maybe an hour, maybe less." The words hit her like a blow. Her chest tightened, and the air around her seemed to shrink. She looked down at her sleeping child, then back at him. "What will you do?" she whispered. He glanced toward the ridge. "We can fight, but they are many. We hide the women and children in the caves. The rest will lead the soldiers away." She knew what that meant. Some of them would not return. The Apache were skilled at vanishing into the land, but against rifles and numbers, courage alone might not be enough. Still, no one protested. The people began to move quickly, gathering what little they could carry. The old and young were guided toward a narrow opening in the rock wall that led into the mountain. The woman followed, her baby wrapped tightly against her chest. The Apache man stopped her at the entrance. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Do not come out until I return." She shook her head, fear rising in her throat. "You can't fight them alone." His expression softened for a moment, the first crack in his steady calm. "I am not alone," he said. "My people fight for their home. You fight for your child. That is how we survive." Before she could reply, he turned and disappeared into the night, his silhouette melting into the trees like smoke. She stood at the cave entrance, staring after him until the darkness swallowed him completely. The other women guided her deeper inside, where the walls were cool and damp. The air smelled of earth and pine. The cave was narrow, barely wide enough for the small group that huddled together inside. The only light came from a small crack near the top where the moonlight slipped through. In thin silver threads, the woman sank to the ground, rocking her baby slowly. The child stirred, but did not cry, as if sensing the danger around them. Outside, the faint sound of movement echoed, the shifting of men, the soft tread of hooves, and then silence. The waiting was the hardest part. Every second stretched into forever. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and steady in her ears. Then came the first gunshot. It cracked through the night like thunder. The echo rolled through the canyon, followed by shouts in English. The women gasped, clutching their children tighter. Another shot rang out, then another, and the quiet exploded into chaos. The woman's hands shook as she tried to calm the baby, whispering soft words into the stillness. Her mind raced with fear. Had they found them already? Outside, the battle grew louder. She could hear horses screaming, men shouting orders. The sharp clash of metal and the hiss of arrows cutting through the air. Every sound painted a picture she didn't want to see. The cave trembled, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The Apache women stayed close together, their faces calm, but their eyes fierce. One of them, the Apache man's sister, crouched near the entrance, gripping a knife. Her eyes met the woman's, and for a moment they shared the same silent thought. This was the night that would decide everything. The woman wanted to believe he would survive. She pictured him out there in the darkness, moving through the trees, every motion sure and silent, the way he had taught the younger men. But the gunfire came closer, sharper, and she knew the soldiers were pushing through the canyon. The Apache were outnumbered, but they would not run easily. This was their home. Minutes bled into hours. The noise outside began to fade, replaced by the sound of wind rustling through the trees. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was thick with uncertainty. The baby stirred again, and she pressed him closer, afraid even to breathe too loudly. The other women whispered prayers under their breath, their voices trembling. The Apache man's sister crawled toward the entrance, peering into the darkness. Then a figure stumbled into the mouth of the cave. It was one of the Apache scouts. His arm hung limp at his side, blood staining his chest. He spoke quickly in his language, his voice raw. The sister's face went pale. She turned to the others. They come. Some escaped, some gone. The woman's stomach dropped. Gone. The word echoed in her head like a tolling bell. She didn't ask if he was among them. She couldn't. The scout fell to the ground, exhausted. The others moved to help him, but before they could, another sound reached them, a voice shouting orders outside, the rough tone unmistakable. English. The soldiers were near. The Apache women moved fast, hiding the wounded man deeper inside the cave. The woman backed into the shadows, holding her child, trying to make herself small. The first soldier appeared at the entrance, a tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight. He raised a lantern, its glow spilling across the cave walls. His eyes narrowed when he saw the figures inside. "Hold it right there," he barked. The sound of rifles being cocked followed from behind him. The Apache sister stepped forward, knife in hand, her face calm and unflinching. The woman felt her heart pounding so hard it hurt. The soldier's gaze fell on her, the pale-skinned woman clutching a child wrapped in Apache cloth. His expression changed instantly. "My God," he whispered. It's true. They took one. He motioned for the others to move in. The Apache sisters shouted a warning, but the soldiers were already stepping closer. Weapons raised. The woman shook her head desperately. No, she cried. They didn't take me. I came on my own. Her voice echoed against the stone, but the men didn't listen. The soldier nearest her looked shocked, almost angry. You don't know what you're saying, ma'am. We'll get you out of here. Before she could answer, chaos erupted again. A shadow dropped from above the Apache man, wounded but alive, striking one of the soldiers from behind. The cave exploded with movement, shouts and gunfire filling the small space. The woman crouched low, shielding her baby as sparks from the rifle flashes lit the walls. The smell of gunpowder mixed with smoke and blood. She heard the Apache sister cry out, then silence. The fight was fast, but brutal. When it was over, the cave was filled with smoke and dust. The soldiers had retreated, dragging one of their own out with them. The Apache man leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, blood seeping from a wound near his shoulder. The woman crawled to him, tears streaming down her face. You're hurt, she whispered. He shook his head faintly. Not bad, he said, though his voice was weak. We must go. More come soon. The others began to move again, gathering what they could, preparing to flee deeper into the mountains. The Apache sister was alive but wounded, her arm bound tightly with a strip of cloth. The woman helped her stand, though her own body trembled from exhaustion and fear. Outside, the night sky was beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. The Apache man guided them along a narrow path that wound up the rocks. Below, the valley was filled with more soldiers, their fires glowing faintly in the distance. The sight made her blood run cold. They won't stop, she whispered. He looked out over the land, his face hard. They never stop, he said quietly. They climbed higher, the air growing thin and cold. The woman's legs ached, but she kept moving, driven by the soft breathing of the child in her arms. Each step felt like a battle against the earth itself. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, though the fear never left. When they finally reached the top of the ridge, the world opened before them, a wide, endless stretch of land bathed in silver light. The woman stood there, gasping for breath. The baby pressed close. The Apache man stood beside her, his face turned toward the horizon. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said, If we cross those mountains, they cannot follow. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. And if they do? She asked softly. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. Then we fight until there is nothing left to take. The wind picked up again, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of smoke from the valley below. The woman felt it settle deep in her chest, the fear, the hope, the unspoken truth that everything could end before the next sunrise. Yet somewhere inside her, a fragile spark refused to die. She looked down at her child, then back at the man beside her. Below them, faint echo of drums began to rise, slow, steady, and distant. The Apache listened, his face turning toward the sound. It was not the soldiers this time. It was his own people, calling across the hills, a signal of defiance and survival. He met her gaze, and for the first time since the storm that had brought them together, she saw something fierce and unbreakable in his eyes. The first light of dawn broke over the peaks, casting long shadows behind them. The woman took a deep breath, steadying herself as they began to move again. The world below was changing, and they were walking straight into the heart of it, where love, loss, and fate were about to collide. The road ahead promised no peace, only the uncertain promise of survival, but she knew now she would follow him anywhere, even into the fire. The rising sun spread its warmth over the ridges, painting the land in soft gold. The air carried the smell of smoke and pine, the scent of a world that had just survived the night. The woman stood near the edge of the mountain, holding her child close as the Apache man rested beside a boulder, his arm wrapped in cloth. The wound still bled a little, but his strength was returning. Around them, the others were quiet, some tending to the injured, others scanning the horizon to be sure the soldiers were truly gone. For the first time in days, There was no sound of pursuit, no echo of gunfire, only silence, wide and deep. Like the earth itself was finally at rest. She looked at him and saw the toll of the days behind them. His face was tired, but his eyes were steady. He had fought for his people, for her, and for a future that still felt uncertain. The woman could feel her heart swelling with both gratitude and sorrow. They had lost so much friends' home, peace, but they had also found something unspoken between them. A bond forged in fear, courage, and survival. He turned to her, his gaze softening. "You can go now," he said quietly. "If you go north, there is a small settlement. They will take you in. It is safer there." His voice was calm, but she could hear what he wasn't saying. If she left, she might never see him again. She shook her head slowly. "And what about you?" He glanced toward the horizon where the valley lay below them, shrouded in morning mist. "My people will move west. There are still villages beyond the river. We will rebuild." He paused, his expression distant. "This land was ours long before anyone came. It will be ours again, one day." The woman looked down at her baby, the child sleeping peacefully despite everything. She thought about what safety really meant, how it wasn't just a place, but the people who stood beside you when everything else fell apart. "I don't want to run anymore," she said softly. "Not without knowing you're safe." He looked at her for a long moment. The sunlight caught in his eyes, making them gleam like the river below. "If you stay, it will not be easy," he warned. "There will always be danger." "I know," she said, "but danger followed me long before I met you. At least here, I can fight for something real." The Apache man nodded slowly, the hint of a faint smile touching his lips. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that broke through the hard edges of the morning. "Then we face it together," he said. The hours that followed were filled with quiet movement. The small group began to make camp higher in the mountains, away from the paths the soldiers might use. Fires were kept small, hidden beneath rock outcroppings to mask the smoke. The Apache sister, still weak from her wound, sat near the fire while the woman tended to her with bandages made from torn cloth. The two spoke little, but there was understanding between them. They had both seen the worst of men, and yet, in this wild place, they had also seen what strength could look like. As the sun climbed higher, the Apache man and a few others went to scout the valley. The woman waited, keeping her child close, her heart never quite still. When he returned near midday, his expression carried cautious hope. "The soldiers have turned back," he said. "They think we went east." Relief rippled through the group like a quiet wave. For the first time since the storm began, they could breathe without fear of being hunted. The next few days passed in slow rhythm. They built shelter from branches and hides, hunted what little game the mountain offered, and gathered water from the streams. The woman began to learn small things: how to make fire without matches, how to read the tracks of deer, how to move silently among the trees. The Apache children watched her with curiosity, sometimes giggling when she stumbled, but their mothers smiled at her efforts. She no longer felt like an outsider at night. When the stars burned bright above them, the woman would sit beside the fire, listening to the Apache man tell stories in his language tales of the wind spirits, the mountains, and the ancestors who walked before them. Even when she didn't understand the words, she felt their meaning. It was about endurance, about the unbroken line between past and future. The rhythm of his voice soothed her, wrapping her in a sense of belonging she hadn't known she needed. Still, there were moments when she wondered if she was doing the right thing. The child she carried would grow up between two worlds, one torn by violence, the other bound by tradition. She feared that one day he might be forced to choose between them. One evening, as she watched the boy sleep beside the fire, she spoke her worry aloud. "Will he ever have peace?" she asked quietly. The Apache man looked at her with calm eyes. "Peace is not a place," he said. "It is what we carry when we refuse to give up. Teach him that, and he will never be lost." His words stayed with her. They carried her through the cold nights and the hard days that followed. Slowly, the scars of the past began to heal, though they would never fully fade. The land itself seemed to remember, holding the echoes of what had happened, but also offering renewal with every sunrise. When spring came, the mountains bloomed again. Wildflowers painted the slopes, and the rivers ran strong with melting snow. The group had grown smaller but stronger, bound together by survival. The woman's child had learned to walk, his small feet stumbling over the rocks, laughter spilling into the air. Every sound of that laughter felt like a promise that life would continue, no matter what the world took away. One morning, as the wind swept across the hills, the Apache man stood watching the valley below. The woman joined him, standing silently at his side. The soldiers were gone. The smoke had cleared. For the first time in months, the land looked untouched. He turned to her, his voice quiet. "There will be other battles," he said. "Maybe not today, maybe not here, but they will come." She nodded. "Then we'll face them when they do." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both pain and pride. "You have the heart of my people," he said. She didn't answer. She just reached for his hand and held it tightly. Together, they stood as the wind moved through the grass, carrying with it the sound of the river and the call of distant birds. That evening, they gathered by the fire again. The Apache sister began to sing a low, steady melody that rose and fell with the rhythm of the night. The woman closed her eyes, letting the song wash over her. It spoke of endurance, of lives reborn after storms, of the bond between earth and spirit. She felt tears on her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from something deeper, a sense of belonging she had never known before. As the flames flickered, the Apache man sat beside her, the glow lighting his face. He glanced toward the child sleeping between them and said softly, "He will know both worlds. That is his strength." She looked at him and smiled. "And yours?" she asked. He gazed at the stars for a long time before answering. "Mine is knowing that the world can change, even if it takes lifetimes." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and the whisper of the land below. The woman leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the quiet peace that had eluded her for so long. They had both lost much, but in the ruins of everything familiar, they had found something enduring: trust, love, and the courage to keep walking forward. When dawn came again, soft light spilling over the hills, she stood and looked out at the valley one last time. The horizon stretched endless and open, waiting for new stories to be written. She turned to him, holding the child close. And together, they began to walk down the mountain path. Each step carried the echo of all they had survived. Behind them, the mountains stood tall and silent, keeping their secrets. Ahead lay the unknown, wide and alive, full of both promise and danger. But for the first time, neither of them feared it. The journey that had begun in darkness was ending in light. The woman knew that no matter where they went, the spirit of this land, the courage, the loss, the love would live within them, and in that truth there was peace. The wind rose once more, brushing through the grass as if to carry their story beyond the hills, across the valley, and into the heart of the world that waited ahead.